as a fan, there's something really magical about bonding to a piece of work, and it just feeling like it speaks directly to you, and there's this feeling of connection with that creator. You know what I mean? Even though you've never met. And this can make for an interesting dynamic with your fans you meet, right? Who think they know you because you communicate to them so directly.
Well, the thing is, I started off as a fan. I was that tongue-tied kid who didn't know what question to ask or how to make a good impression or how to find out what I wanted. And I was lucky enough quite early on to run into people who were very, very gracious to me. There's a very famous British comic book artist called Frank Hampson who created a character called Dan Dare, which I loved as a kid. And I got to meet him, and he was so nice to me. I got to meet people like Will Eisner, who was an absolute gentleman, answered all my questions. Actually, this was before I had much of a name or a reputation. He very graciously spent 30 minutes, an hour with me, critiquing my work, listening to me, encouraging me, making me feel a fellow professional. So I know exactly what's going on in the fan's head when they want to make conversation or they want to ask you a question. And by and large, the overwhelming majority of fans are so, again, gracious and kind and polite. And I'm always happy to talk to them. You get the odd one who perhaps feels rather more entitled than he or she is. But I would deal with them as I hope I would deal with people in the real world, to just gently move away from them. But no, I love the interaction with fans. I love going to conventions. I love hearing what people think of my work. After all, I've spent most of my life kind of I'm not being flippant, but kind of in lockdown, in a room on my own, wondering, do people care? And when people obviously do care, and they tell you that the work that you've done in that way has had a positive effect on them, or has made them think, or has opened a door for them, that's just a wonderful thing. So yeah, I'm really, really happy to have the interaction with fans. The guys that I spoke to on the Hero Initiative thing the other day, I'd go for a drink with those guys any day. They were so charming and asked me such great questions, and obviously thought about it so much. So yeah, that's me, an interaction with fans, really.
I think when you create such smart work, you're going to get smart fans. You know what I mean? Where when I go to conventions, like if I'm at my kid's school event with parents of my kid's school, they'll say, "What's your favorite movie?" And they've never heard of my favorite movie or my favorite music. And then I go to comic conventions, and we're all listening to the same music and reading the same books and watching the same movies.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point as well, Chris. When I was growing up, when I was a fan, I knew maybe a couple of other people who were sort of interested in comics. They had nothing like my passion, but I was kind of the only comic fan for miles around. And then, of course, you end up going to San Diego or any one of these big conventions. There's 200,000 people. It's like, this is my nation. These are my people. And as you say, we've got the same influences. You only have to make one reference and you immediately are on the same page as a fellow fan. And yeah, it is a wonderful feeling of coming together and meeting up with the same kind of people, and they are the same kind of people. I'm pleased in recent years that it has broadened into not just white guys, but there's much greater diversity, which is terribly enriching to the field as well. And also there's much more variety of subject matter. It's not all just superheroes. It's not just funny animals. There's such a range of stuff now. And so I think as we've coalesced, that we've adopted new people into the family, and the family is much stronger and much richer for that.
It's funny, as you bring that up, I'm thinking to myself, my generation can thank you and the creators, like you, who really pushed the envelope and the boundaries in what could be done here. And I was, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was lucky enough to be, you know, right place at the right time. You know, the way comics used to be in the UK, and I think probably in the US as well, was they were done by people who had a very kind of low opinion of the field. They were kind of drawing comics until they could get a proper job painting ads for companies or doing paperback covers or being fine artists. A lot of the writers, you know, were waiting to write their great American novel or great British novel. But my generation, the generation that grew up reading comics and always wanting to do comics, we came into the field once we'd learnt our chops, once we were professional, wanting just to do comics, as has been the case for me. I've spent a happy lifetime doing comics. I've never had any real aspiration to do anything much outside of telling stories in words and pictures. And so I think that once you start to get people working in the field who were in love with the field, rather than just tolerating it or seeing it as a means to put food on the table, you then, you know, the excitement and the interest and the love of the form just grew and grew and grew, from people like me who broke in the early 70s to people in the 80s, the 90s and beyond. So I think the thing that has been great in a way is that we've been able to take, my generation, say, has taken the torch and has passed it on and is now letting other people run with it. And I think if you love something, to have a feeling that you've enriched it or you've broadened it or you've enhanced it in some way is a wonderful feeling to have. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day about collaboration in comics, which is a thing that I've always loved, and I've been really lucky. I've had a chance to play with some really great people. Obviously, Alan Moore, Frank Miller, Mike Mignola, Steve Rude. You know, there's a huge list. But the most important thing about collaboration is you have to leave your ego at the door. You know, you have to do what is good for the project, not what is your idea and it's going in because it's my idea. And all the best collaborators, and obviously people like Alan and Frank, you know, they're not without egos any more than I'm not without an ego. But we all realise that when it comes to doing the work, to being creative, the ego kind of has no place in that at all.
How do you decide? I guess if you come up with the story, you write it, and if someone pitches a story that you like, you draw it. Is that how you determine if you're writing or drawing, or?
Yeah, I mean, most of the drawing gigs have been because I've got talking to writers that I enjoy, and you inevitably end up saying, yeah, wouldn't it be great to do something together? I mean, that was kind of what happened with Mark Miller and Secret Service. We'd known each other for a while and we liked each other's work, and it was, yeah, let's do something together, you know. Quite often with the writing, it tends to be an editorial suggestion. I mean, I wrote a Batman Predator thing that was a suggestion from Dark Horse Comics, and the Green Lantern Corps, which I had spent a couple of years writing later, that was Dan Didio at DC said, hey Dave, you know, we really loved what you used to do with Green Lantern. Do you want to write and draw the Green Lantern Corps? So, you know, that's how that tends to happen. But I was saying to somebody the other day, what I've always tended to do is to keep a notebook where I'll write little bits of dialogue or story ideas or sketches. And it's funny, you look back through that, or even stuff I've heard people say or things from the TV, little turns of phrase, and you look back on this, you think, hey, if I put that and that together, then I've got this story, you know. So that's my advice to anybody who wants to write, is keep notes, look out for stories. And they somehow, I mean, in the case of the originals, which was autobiographical, most of that is things that actually happened. It was just a question of assembling them in the right order. So I think if you're a storyteller, even when you're talking anecdotally, you can't help but make stories, you know. And in fact, Chris, before you asked me, and even if you weren't going to ask me, I'm going to say it anyway, but one of the things I've been working on in the last couple of years is my autobiography, where I've done it as a series of anecdotes. It's not a chronological thing, you know, my early struggles, my later success. It's an alphabetical thing where it'll be the name of something I've worked on or the name of a collaborator or something, just to give me a hook to hang an anecdote on. So it's like about 100,000 words of anecdotes. And again, you know, I can't help but do it like that. Even this answer to you, it's a story. What can I say?
So it's the Dave Gibbons autobiographical encyclopedia.
It's an alphabetical anecdotal autobiography.
That's great. The way you just described how you write is exactly how I write, and as you described it, I realized it's from my music background, because I'm in a band in theory. It's been years since we've practiced or performed, but I still consider us a band. And writing songs, it's the same thing, where I would just come up with a line to a song, or just a rhyme or a word, and then over time I've got these notebooks full of just little words or phrases. And then you pick and choose and go, okay, these all go together, there's a song. And I realize, as you said, I do write comic books that way too.
My favourite kind of music, I've always liked a good song, a thing in which the words and the music are, you can't take them apart, and you think of them as what I believe people call a gestalt. It's just, that's the way they are. You obviously think of people like Dylan, but I've always loved people like, and you know, this is old school, I know, people like Elvis Costello or Crowded House, or, you know, those kind of people who write such clever songs, which the music isn't the important thing, the words aren't the important thing, and it's the way the words and the music mesh to give a third effect. So I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking, yeah, it's probably no coincidence that I love a kind of a hybrid art in a way like comic books, and a hybrid art like songwriting, which is kind of poetry meets music, you know? So I'm really interested to hear you say that. I think that makes great sense. In that I agree with it. That's why it makes great sense.
Yeah, and you bring up if pictures are saying something different than the words, and you know, Watchmen is maybe the first thing I know of that really took advantage of that. Were you guys aware of other comics doing that? Because I'm thinking of, you know, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby comics where, you know, it shows him thinking, and then a thought bubble is, I'm thinking now, you know, where it just hammers you over the head. You know, this is what, whereas the more sophisticated storytelling, was that something you guys were kind of coming up with and inventing, or were you aware of other people doing that before?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose we've been aware of it in artists like, or comics authors like Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eisner, where again, the word, you couldn't really tell where the pictures started and the words ended. And they would always have rhythm in their things and callbacks to earlier themes. And you know, Kurtzman was quite a formal storyteller. He would have these set pieces where maybe the object you were looking at moved, but the background stayed the same, or everything stayed the same, but you as the observer moved around it. So with Watchmen, what we wanted to do is explore all the possibilities of comics, all the things you could only really do in comics, those kind of Eisner, Kurtzman things. We also knew it was going to be a really complex story, and I suggested to Alan that we did it as a 9-panel grid, because that would simplify the look of it. It would also help Alan write it in that he knew exactly how much space everything was going to take on a page. It also enabled him to give kind of the language a form of poetry because of the way it was going to have to be broken. And it sort of gave us almost like a rhythm track or a click track, do they call it, you know? So we were aware of all that stuff. And yeah, I suppose if we hadn't done it in that precisely formal way, that the music of it would have got lost. And also the other thing that was important, we wanted to make sure that every page was clearly a page from Watchmen. And by impressing that grid on it, and also by the way that John Higgins coloured it, which was a very particular palette, which is another side of the storytelling, which I don't know if there is a musical equivalent of that. Perhaps it's the guy on bass, you know, I don't know. But it's certainly by giving ourselves restrictions, or by giving ourselves like a time signature, we had to make it work in a certain way. So that to me was always a good example of creativity through repression, or creativity through restriction, I think. You know, that it has to be this, and it has to be that, and it has to be this. Now you've got a little closely defined area in which to be really creative, rather than just just go any way you like.